are these kinds of movements that we're seeing, like Occupy Wall Street, are they the new normal? If Gidi's right that the cost of collective action has been so lowered that everybody can now participate, you know, there's always going to be people who are angry about something, and so regardless of how we deal with this current movement, we're going to have other movements just like it protesting something else, and we've just got to get used to this moment. So.
Well, it's a great question, and thanks for including me in this. This has been fascinating. As I've been thinking through the Arab Spring over the last couple of months, I've thought of it as being a wonderful potential liberation for people throughout the Arab world and an inspiration to people around the world, and perhaps most critically, something that communication scholars will be arguing about for the next 5 years. And what's been so great is realizing that it's not just communication scholars, it's the political scientists and the economists. So I'm glad that everyone can get involved with that aspect of things. Many of the questions that you've been putting forward, Tarek, are the sorts of questions that we're trying to answer at this group that I have at this small technical college down the street from here, which is really looking at the intersection of how media and social change work together. And the bias of this particular technical college is to build things first and then see how they change things. I've been at Harvard long enough that I have enough theory sort of, you know, coating my coat that I sort of feel periodically compelled to actually frame these questions in terms of what do we think happened in the Arab Spring, and how might it inform how we think through social media and change on sort of a broader set. You put forward a couple of interesting ideas for how the rise of digital media, which we might think of as participatory media, basically media that makes it far easier for individuals to create content and share it potentially with a broad audience, how that might affect how we protest, how we organize, how we change civil society. And first, I actually think it's worth spending a little bit of time on the null hypothesis. And probably the thinker who's been most visible around this is Malcolm Gladwell, whose very fertile mind has sort of locked onto this for a short period of time, but put out a piece in the New Yorker where he basically said, it can't be the internet. And his logic behind it can't be the internet is that he sees the internet as being all about weak ties, about people that you barely know as Facebook friends, and that he sees real social change being about people who are willing to put themselves in real risk, in physical space, and that's the sort of thing that you only do with very strong ties, people you really care about. Now, he's right about a lot of things. He's totally wrong on this one. He's wrong, first of all, because his picture of the internet is wrong. The picture of the internet, where the internet is all about people you don't know, is a completely antiquated picture of this. This is now, for people who've grown up in an internet generation, a space where many of their strongest social ties exist. And some of the ties in the neighborhoods are much weaker than you might expect them to be. So this is a place where, in fact, you can mobilize both strong and weak capital. At the same time, he's wrong in his theory of social change. If all you can organize are the people who are closest to you, then you're never going to change anything. What you actually have to be able to do is bridge between different social ties. And this was, in fact, what was so exciting in Tunisia, in Egypt, was watching many, many different groups of people get together and take into the streets. You've also referenced Arkan Fung, and he's so complicated and varied in this space that I'm only going to deal with a small aspect of what he's thought about and talked about, which is something that I might talk about as the missing information theory, or the hidden information theory. And this is the theory that in many ways has sort of been mobilizing US policy around this idea of internet freedom. It's this idea that if only we could get the secret information into China, or into North Korea, or into Tunisia, people would realize that they're being screwed with and that they're being lied to, and then suddenly you'll see the emergence of this digital network public sphere, and then people will rise up and change. And what's wrong with this theory, which, by the way, is being advocated by a bunch of people, including WikiLeaks, who would really love to sort of claim credit for the Arab Spring, is that it's very hard to see how this hidden information gets beyond the small, limited population of people who are able to access it. I spent a lot of my time the last decade studying internet filtering. It's not so easy for people in Tunisia to get this information as we headed going in towards the revolution. The third major theory that goes out there, it's sort of the Clay Shirky, the Howard Rheingold, here comes everybody, smart mobs theory. Let's all get out into the street. I'll send a text message to everybody and we'll all show up at EDSA and we'll overthrow the Philippine government. It's certainly got some evidence that it's worked in the past, but there's some real problems in applying it to the Arab Spring, particularly applying it in Egypt, where we know that social media was only of limited effect getting people out into the street. Actual marches in neighborhoods seem to have more to do with it, and where the movement really took shape when the internet actually got shut down. So let me offer one other theory. It's not a comprehensive theory, but it's a theory that I'm sort of using to try to figure out how to break these things apart and to think about how we might try to explain Occupy and ultimately get to the point where we answer your question. I think you want to look at this problem from patient zero. I think you want to look at Tunisia, and I think you want to look very, very specifically at something very strange that happened in Tunisia. We have seen lots of small regionalized protests in Tunisia, and they follow the same script. Somebody gets angry, people taken to the streets in a small town, Ben Ali's government cordons off the town, they fire live ammunition at people, the media never gets in because it's completely tame and there's no foreign media in the country, no one finds out about it, and within a week everybody's back in their homes. And we know this happened because this happened in Gafsa in 2008, a town just down the road from Sidi Bouzid, and we know because we watched people mobilize, we tried to watch them mobilize on the internet, and they did a pretty good job of documenting it on the internet, but for some reason it didn't make it and didn't make it into a nationwide revolution. 2 years later, we see a fairly similar protest, and somehow this one spreads. And picking this apart, we're starting to get a sense of what ends up happening. It's a very complicated process, but the quick version says, first of all, mobile phones are critically important. They let you have this power of surveillance, of watching from below. They let you become a media author at a very, very low cost, but you can only become an author if you can find a way to share it. In this case, the way in Tunisia people find a way to share it is via Facebook. And it's not because Facebook is a wonderful technology for revolutions. It's actually the last one that I would choose for overthrowing a government. But it happened to be the only one that Ben Ali's government was not blocking at that point. People record videos, they put them up on Facebook, and then the assumption is that they spread virally, and that's absolutely untrue. And when you hear people say that something spread virally, it generally means, I don't know how it spread. In this case, we do know how it spread. It did not spread person to person, because Facebook was under surveillance in Tunisia, widely under surveillance, and anyone who was in the know knew that it was under surveillance and that joining the Friends of Mohammed Bouazizi group was bad for your health and probably likely to get you arrested. What ended up happening is you had dissident media in the diaspora, particularly an organization called Nawat, which was following this media, curating it, packaging it together, and handing it out for anyone to amplify. And the people who ended up amplifying were Al Jazeera, because they were deeply pissed off that they'd never been able to run a news bureau in the country. And then Al Jazeera had this very interesting power, which is rather than the internet, which reached about 17% of Tunisians, Al Jazeera reached most Tunisians. And we know that the government started getting very upset about this because we saw the very strange phenomenon of security policemen going to cafes in Tunis and begging cafe owners to change the channel. What ended up happening is that participatory media was the backdoor into the media cycle. And not into a participatory media cycle, a mainstream broadcast media cycle. What happens when you're able to have influence on broadcast media is that you can have a great deal of coordinating effect. You can essentially say, this small protest that we're having in this dusty little town of 28,000 people, you could be part of this too. And that's what started happening through Tunisia, and to a large extent, that's what happened as Tunisia starts spreading through the region. So I want to suggest that one of the most powerful things that comes out of this moment in participatory culture is this ability for people to become media authors and media influencers. You can see this happen right now in Syria, where it's gotten so dangerous to protest, literally so threatening to your life, that the new technique that is out there are these flash protests, where you get people together for about 2 minutes, you protest very quickly, you scatter in all different directions, but critically, you videotape it, you get it up on the internet, and you make sure that there's visibility about it because you understand that there's an entire cycle of people who want to have something to do with this. How does this play into the larger space? I think in some ways in a fairly bad and dangerous way. I think that we saw a great deal of success out of this influencing the media model within Tunisia and in Egypt. I think we've seen the decreasing success of this model as it's gone throughout the rest of the Arab Spring. And what I'm watching right now are the people who are involved with Occupy Wall Street be really obsessed with their media portrayal. And one of the interesting things about Occupy has been watching these guys freak out over Twitter tags. They haven't been trending on Twitter. And this has turned literally into something of a scandal in the tech community. Is Twitter somehow censoring so that Occupy Wall Street doesn't have sufficient energy or attention? What this says to me is that people are looking for ways to participate in political systems that they feel deeply alienated from. They feel like the levers of power that they were told they had control over, that they could adjust, they could have influence through, simply aren't working. And one set of levers that they know they have control over because of this particular moment in technology is their ability to create and disseminate media. And I think people are simply reaching for the tools that they know, that they are familiar with, that they're comfortable with, and that they're hoping that it may somehow have a result in the same way that it did in a place like Tunisia or in Egypt. I think it's very unlikely to. I'm not sure that any amount of press coverage is going to get Occupy Wall Street to somehow have Wall Street bankers agree to a massive redistribution of wealth. And if I had a good way of influencing that media cycle, I would be pushing people to be occupying Congress at the moment rather than occupying Wall Street. But if I wanted to try to find a way to draw a thread, not just between the Arab Spring, but also between Occupy, between some of these student movements, and perhaps between the Tea Party, which I also think is something that we have to consider, and that I'm going to bring in as an American into this conversation, is this general sense of dissatisfaction, alienation, and a sense that the levers of civic power are stuck, and that we need to find another way to move them. When you talk about that question of wanting to be recognized and wanting to be seen, I think that's absolutely right, but I think it's this larger symptom of feeling so disempowered by the structures that are ahead that the best that you can do is say, well, at least I can get on television, and at least I can get on the internet, and perhaps that's going to take me somewhere. The thing that I deeply worry about is that I'm not sure that there's an actual theory of change behind it. I'm not sure that the notion of getting more airtime, more visibility, more newspaper coverage actually gets you to the point where any of these movements lead to substantive political change over time. So, my attempt to answer your question.
All right, so we have about 10 more minutes, and so hopefully we can now, after having diagnosed all these problems and sounded various notes of pessimism, try to figure out what we can do to move forward from this. So, questions? Yes, sir.
First of all, thank you very much for the presentations. I just had a couple thoughts or questions and wanted to get your reaction. The first is the question of whether, the media or whether the galvanization of people, whether there's an asymmetry there, in the sense that repressive or unpopular regimes, and unpopular also in a particular way, that they're not only unpopular with their own people, but also unpopular within the global, leadership. Whether they can be toppled, but it's unclear whether these same forces can lead to good outcomes in terms of what replaces them. So there's a big issue here. And I think the data is too small in my view. We only have Tunisia, a country that probably doesn't figure in the scheme of things in a big way of the global players. What happens to Egypt, I think, is interesting and may help us determine how, the power of the people will actually, whether it will encounter resistance from other forces. And this is a thought that I wanted to get from you, because also in Libya, let's be frank. I mean, there was a massive external, intervention of a sustained military type that at least influenced outcomes in the end. So it's not just Twitter at work, but much more.
Twitter with NATO bombs.
So I think the old-fashioned way of replacing regimes is also very much at work here. And we should try, I think that aspect was missing in the discussion. So perhaps we should think about those forces also in addition to the public. And they will, you know, how things shape up might also be influenced by that.
Ishac, do you want to have a crack at that question?
Well, I agree with you. I think this is the worst way of toppling regimes. And unfortunately, it's like a dam bursting. And after 30 years and was it 5 or 6 presidencies, it seems like there was no choice. And the fact that it was the people in the street that was leaderless is just an expression of the fact that there was no parties, no organization, no leaders. So it's unfortunate, but I think there was no choice. What you feel in retrospect is that these regimes were committing suicide, totally unable to regulate corruption, grand corruption. The stories coming out of Tunisia, Ben Ali's corruption are enormous, same in Egypt. So, I mean, after all, Arab exceptionalism is the only region in the world that has not experienced democracy. Latin America, Africa, Eastern Europe, and the like. And the reason for it are the reason that kept these autocrats in power for so long. What I spoke about before, that the utilization of violence in politics, dividing to rule and taking advantage of something that scares the West to get support, as we said, support from the rest of the world. So there was probably no other alternative but to have these dams burst. In Libya how do we think about Libya? I mean, could it have happened peacefully, as say in Egypt or Tunisia? Was Libya kind of the bad apple of the Middle East? It's not clear, because at least in Libya, with all the violence, the regime has changed dramatically. In Egypt, it hasn't yet. It's an ongoing revolution. We still have to see what will come out of this. When the army didn't shoot, it actually managed to stay in power.
Any questions? Or else I'll ask one. Go ahead.
I wonder about I wonder about the lack of leadership, partly through things like the internet, pop-up revolutions. Because if you look at historic revolutions, usually they form around one person or a group of people. If you have all of these, a protest here, a protest there, a protest there, in which you only need to get, let's say, 100 people, 1,000 people, there really doesn't need to be a leader. And yet I feel as though, perhaps in Tunisia as well, that where is the leadership for all of these, nascent revolutions?
You may not need a leader to at least start organizing a protest, but it really helps to have a common target and a common opponent. And certainly one of the things that unites the protests of the Arab Spring is the fairly easy, as my colleague was saying, sort of Freudian father of, let's all beat up on the dictator. And in some ways that makes it much easier than some of these later protests where it's much, much clearer who you coordinate around. I guess I also want to call into question a little bit some of this notion of spontaneous emergence and leaderlessness. There's been a lot of analysis sort of trying to figure out, whether there are leaders behind the scenes sort of secretly leading all of this. And many of the better analyses I've seen make the case that in the more successful protests, what happened were existing political organizations, whether they were labor unions, whether they were already experienced protest movements, found ways to put aside enough difference that they were able to sort of get together and work collectively. One other thing that I would just mention, in part because we have Ricardo in the room, is that in the same way that economic complexity allows you to have greater success. Media complexity allows you to have greater success. And I don't think it's entirely coincidental that Egypt and Tunisia are the two countries in which, in the Arab world, you'd have very, very active, media-savvy, very smart blogging communities working for a decade now. Creating anti-regime propaganda. And actually responding to the first question, what's interesting is that the two regimes that fell first are regimes that actually were dictators in very good favor. And they were dictators with very, very good PR. Right? Tunisia had good enough PR that it managed to host the World Summit on the Information Society in 2005, despite the fact that the country was thoroughly censored and that some of us, myself included, got thrown out of the country for doing workshops on free speech in the context of that. But they'd managed the PR equation very, very thoroughly. In those PR states, the dictator's hand is actually somewhat stayed. It's much, much harder to open fire. That's actually what's different with Libya, is sort of the realization that, you know, this is bad dictator versus good dictator, and that actually changes a lot of that equation.
We have time for one more question, so we'll take it.
Look, I'd just like to challenge the notion that something new is happening here in terms of mass mobilization with the Arab Spring, because if you take a look at 1989 and 1990 and the collapse of the East European governments, you had literally hundreds of thousands, and in the case of East Germany, you might even begin to talk about over 1 million people, you know, protesting with their feet, marching, changing. Not very many leaders in evidence. It was a regional phenomenon, a lot of governments with something in common, not unlike what we've seen with autocracies and corrupt governments in the Middle East. In Latin America, it took a little longer across the 1980s and into the early 1990s, but the collapse of military governments across the region. These are crises of legitimacy in certain concentrated regions of the world, and of course different factors at different moments in history come into play to help that mobilization, but the fundamental factor at play is a crisis of legitimacy, and I would argue over the last 30 years in the 3 regions of the world where we've seen relatively sudden political change, it's regions which have coalesced around autocratic systems of government which coincide in losing legitimacy at the same time.
So that's a great question on which to end. Certainly in the Arab world, for example, we can think of a couple of examples like this too. We think about Algeria in 1991, that's what we think about. But in fact, where the Islamists won an election that the army then abrogated. But of course, what were the conditions that allowed there to be an election that the Islamists could win? There were mass protests in the late 80s, and the regime had to kind of open up. So are we sort of just wasting our time here, and should we be looking for some deeper causes for all this? And in 1 minute for
to be honest, I'm very worried. I think that there is a clear distinction between the Middle East and what's going on in Europe and in other countries. In the Middle East, the writing was on the wall. The UN Development Report of a few years ago was there. Those of you that read the response of Arab intellectuals to this report, it had the word Israel there 100 times. This was a report about the condition of women and economy and so on. So there was a total blocking and suppressing of the issues, and it all erupted. In the West, what I'm seeing is, and I'm very worried, I see massive publics with a huge sense of potency. And I see governments with impotency. And this clash is very, very dangerous. And to me, the response is very clear. But it requires a sort of a new social contract. Number one, we need a total redefinition, a reimagining of what is business social responsibility. In Israel today, for example, you could be honored for your business social responsibility when you're a quasi-monopoly, because you're good with the environment. These are kind of things that cannot continue. Number one. Number two, emphasis on small and medium-sized enterprises. In Israel, 30% of the labor market is in small and medium-sized enterprises. Yesterday, the Prime Minister of Poland won again. That was the focus of his policy. The only country stable in Europe is Poland. I'm not an expert on Poland, but I think maybe there's something there in terms of the indications. And the third thing is, there has to be some sort of a pact about long-term accumulation of human, social, and financial capital for people, especially for children. The biggest victims of this whole crisis are children of the middle class, lower middle class, and poor people, and this is where the focus needs to be.
All right, well, please join me in thanking our panelists for a very enlightening debate.